Good morning, everyone, and welcome to PICHTR's Beyond Hazard and Vulnerability Planning, Weighing the Cost, Benefits, and Challenges of Climate Adaptation. I am Veronica Rocha. I will be emceeing today's event. However, the moderator for the panel is going to be Melissa May of SSFM, who I will be introducing shortly. So we're waiting for folks to come online. We already have 58 participants, and I see more are joining. A few housekeeping items. First of all, I just want to make sure everybody knows that this session is being recorded. Afterwards, we will be posting the session and the presentations on PICHTR's website. Everybody that registered for today's event is going to receive an email with access to both the recording and the presentations. Also, I want to remind and encourage everybody here to please use the chat and the Q&A functions. Please use the chat to enter any sort of comments or reactions that you may have. So to get us started, if you can please introduce yourself, let us know where you're calling from and how you heard about this webinar. If I could get some responses, that would be excellent. Somebody just mentioned that the chat is disabled. Not a problem, because I think the show must go on. So let's go ahead and use the Q&A for both chat and questions and answers. So in the Q&A, feel free to please introduce yourselves. Let us know where you're calling from, how you heard about today's webinar, and also feel free to enter your questions at any time. Melissa and we are going to be monitoring the Q&A. Melissa is going to be moderating and questions and answers with the panelists and the audience later in today's session. Marie Williams from Kauai County Planning Department, welcome. And yeah, we just really look forward to engaging with you and this very dynamic group of panelists that we have here. Several other people have joined. We are already at 74 folks. We have Amber Shim from Michigan, Alan Clinton from Kauai, Dennis, also from PICHTR, Marie Williams, and several other people. So welcome, everybody. Really appreciate your presence. I can tell there's a really strong presence from Kauai today. So really excited for Neighbor Island folks to be joining us today. To get us started, I would like to thank our sponsors. You know, really these climate adaptation collective webinars that we do cannot be possible without the generous support of our sponsors. Today's webinar in particular is being sponsored and in close collaboration with SSFM International and Integral Consulting, and also our ongoing sponsor, Island Insurance. Just really appreciate all of your support. A quick overview of today's session. And by the way, it's really exciting. I see the numbers keep going up on the number of participants for today's sessions. So overview, I'm going to just simply give a very quick overview on PICHTR's climate adaptation. I'm going to be introducing Melissa May of SSFM, who is our moderator for today. And then I'm going to turn it over to Melissa, who is going to be giving us a discussion backdrop. She's going to be presenting panelists and walking us through this excellent lineup of presentations and taking us through as well through a group discussion. So without further ado, let me introduce PICHTR. PICHTR is a 501c3 nonprofit organization that was established in 1985 with a mission to expand economic opportunities in Hawaii by promoting public-private partnerships and advancing sustainable development. PICHTR's latest project and initiative is the Climate Adaptation Collective, which seeks to proactively tackle barriers to climate change adaptation by providing capacity building and advocacy to decision makers and the general public to enable forward progress on the most critical climate change adaptation initiatives of our time. We understand that proactive climate adaptation is an opportunity for a more resilient and economically strong Hawaii, and we hope that the content that we provide here is going to be useful to other geographies as well. Today's session is part of our capacity building efforts to increase awareness and understanding of climate change adaptation challenges, solutions, as well as opportunities in Hawaii. For today's session, I would like to introduce our excellent moderator, Melissa May of SSFM. She is a senior planner and resilience practice leader who has excellent experience. She designs and facilitates inclusive planning processes that bring together community, government, and technical stakeholders to create shared visions and implementable plans for resilient and sustainable communities. Her areas of specialty include climate resilience, policymaking, active transportation, community-based economic development, and renewable energy, all of which are key ingredients to thriving, sustainable communities. So with that, Melissa, thank you so much for being our moderator today. I also want to just acknowledge that Melissa has been instrumental in the development of today's topic of discussion as well as programming. So just really appreciate your collaboration and that of SSFM International, our other panelists and their companies as well, and the state of Hawaii. So with that, Melissa, can I please turn it over to you?
Absolutely. Thank you, Veronica. And I really appreciate PICHTR for agreeing to convene this conversation and collaborate with all of us on it. It's a really, I think, a conversation that's been marinating over quite a while, over many different projects and collaborations, both with the team that's presenting today and many of you that are in on the call. So it's really exciting to see so many friends and colleagues on the line. I just think it's a really timely next step to start talking about climate adaptation because, for quite a while now, Hawaii has had a pretty strong baseline when it comes to climate vulnerabilities, and we're fortunate to have great resources at UH and to have a good understanding of our vulnerabilities and where they are. There's always room for improvement, but compared to a lot of other places, we really are ahead, and that goes for regulatory movement as well. Everybody across the country and the world is grappling with the same issue of how to address the increasing impacts of climate change and how to make difficult decisions about what to do with development and infrastructure when there is so much at stake. And Hawaii really has taken a leading role in that. We've got some of the most progressive shoreline setback ordinances. Hawaii was one of the first in the country to put in a zoning overlay with regards to sea level rise. And Honolulu, with our Office of Climate Change and Resilience, has done a lot of groundbreaking work. So really all the counties have a big role to play, and now we have OPSD in a coordinating role and pushing forward much of that conversation and coordination at the state level. So we're in a good spot, but the question that's been in my mind as I've worked across the state and in many different communities is, what do we do now? So now that we understand our vulnerabilities, how do we move forward with deciding what solutions to pursue and how do we evaluate those? So really the people here today have been brought here because they have some answers to that. I think Office of Planning can speak a lot to the agency coordination that's needed and the initiatives that are being put forward at the state level to make that happen. And then our other panelists have national experience doing climate adaptation, and they've developed tools that will enable agencies, developers, people all over the state to really apply climate adaptation in a way that's replicable, defensible, and based on sound analysis. So really look forward to having them share their tools and methods. And without further ado, I'm going to introduce them. So let me get to my write-ups here. Okay, so starting with Sarah Chang, she's a project analyst with the Office of Planning and Sustainable Development Coastal Zone Management Program. And she is in charge of coordinating the Ocean Resources Management Plan for the state, which highlights 3 areas of need within the coastal zone: development and coastal hazards, land-based pollution, and marine ecosystems. And so this is really an avenue for collaborative implementation between agencies with regard to shoreline and ocean resources. And so she'll have a lot to say about how we make that happen. David Revel is another colleague of mine that I met through work on the North Shore with the Coastal Resilience Working Group up there. He's with Integral Consulting and is their coastal resilience principal. And he's also been involved in some of the most groundbreaking work on climate adaptation for infrastructure, such as roadways in Santa Cruz, California, where he lives. And he's also a coastal geomorphologist with over 25 years experience. So I think his bio is also in the webinar description. There's a lot more to it. I'll go to Paul Shanowski next, who's actually represented today by his lead technical engineer, Jake Hellman. And Jake will be talking about resilient analytics, which developed a proprietary tool that has helped with a decision-making framework for climate adaptation. Basically helps agencies, including the UN and the World Bank and infrastructure agencies all over the country, has helped them sort out different climate adaptation options for infrastructure and develop a investment timeline for those projects. So he'll share about that. And then we've got Dave Anning, who is also from Integral Consulting, and I met him through David Revel. So Dave, I was fascinated with his work on economic valuation. So he's an environmental economist, and he works with quantifying things that are difficult to quantify, such as recreation, environmental benefits, surfing industries, tourism, many of the things that we're going to have to understand how to put numbers on if we're going to evaluate climate adaptation options for Hawaii. So it's very exciting to have him here. Thanks, Dave. And with that, we'll start our presentations. Each panelist will present for about 10 minutes, and you can enter your questions at any time. I'll be kind of collating them, and at the end of the presentations, we'll go into discussion. So let's get started. Let's start with Sarah.
Okay, just checking you all can see my slide.
Yes, you're good.
Yes, okay, great, thanks. Okay, so hi, good morning, everybody. As Melissa said, my name is Sarah Chang. I am a project analyst with the Hawaii Coastal Zone Management Program, which is housed within the State Office of Planning and Sustainable Development, or OPSD. OPSD has several programs that are integrating climate adaptation into land use planning decisions, such as our transit-oriented development program, which works on reducing reliance on vehicles and encouraging accessibility along public transit areas, as well as our statewide sustainability program, which developed the 2050 statewide sustainability plan. But today, I'm just going to be focusing on what the Coastal Zone Management Program, or CZM, is doing, and our role with climate adaptation planning, some of the coordination we're doing, as Melissa had mentioned, and the initiatives we're pursuing to address the sea level rise and coastal erosion challenges facing the state. So first, just a little bit about CZM. We're a network agency. We collaborate with others that have land and water resource management responsibilities. As the state's resource management policy umbrella, the CZM program encourages agencies to look at resource management from a broader ecosystem perspective, and through the state's CZM law requires agencies to comply with CZM policies and objectives, which include things like beach and coastal dune protection, reducing hazard to life and property from coastal hazards, and protecting beaches for public use and recreation. CZM also serves as the convening entity to lead the development and implementation of the State Ocean Resources Management Plan, which we often call the ORMP. And the ORMP is a main component of the CZM program, and its implementation is reliant on collaborative cross-agency action. The most recent version was done in 2020 and highlights three main focus areas, one of which is coastal hazards and development. So many of the projects that I'll be discussing in a little bit are ORMP projects that incorporate climate adaptation work to address those current and projected climate impacts. And then finally, our OPSD director serves as a co-chair of the Hawaii State Climate Change Mitigation and Adaptation Commission, along with the chair of the Department of Land and Natural Resources. And as well, our CZM program manager is a commissioner. So through the ORMP and the Climate Commission, CZM is actively facilitating and participating in discussions around climate adaptation to ensure alignment across multiple agencies and sectors. So in terms of where we are generally as a state, I think we're very fortunate in that the impacts of coastal hazards and the need to incorporate mitigation and adaptation planning, adaptation into planning is broadly accepted at the administrative and political levels. After discussions with agency representatives, we found that most agencies are in the vulnerability assessment phase. There are some that are a little further ahead, such as DOT, which has conducted a vulnerability assessment as well as developed a climate action plan. But the majority of agencies, while acknowledging the need, have expressed that lack of capacity is a major obstacle in taking steps towards adaptation planning, let alone conducting vulnerability assessments. And then beyond the state level, it would be remiss to not acknowledge that there is a lot of work being done at the county level as well. As Melissa had mentioned, many counties now have climate offices and are developing climate action plans. So there are groups looking at and thinking about adaptation planning from many perspectives. But going back to CZM, and in areas where we've sort of been taking the lead, particularly related to sea level rise and coastal erosion, we currently have projects underway that kind of fall into 4 themes that we see as needing to be addressed in order to facilitate this movement from a vulnerability assessment phase to an adaptation planning phase. And these 4 themes also contribute towards one of our ORMP's stated goals of developing shoreline management strategies. So those 4 themes are governance, natural environment, built environment, and people. So I'm just going to quickly run through some of these things that we're doing under those 4 themes. So for governance, one of the most commonly cited challenges with regards to shoreline management in Hawaii is the bifurcated jurisdiction, with state being responsible for land, Makai of the shoreline, and counties having responsibility for land, Mauka of the shoreline. This shared governance allows for a multi-agency review of proposed projects and helps to ensure compliance with existing laws and ordinances. However, it can create challenges when there is lack of consensus on how to manage the shoreline, or if there's a misalignment of existing plans and policies. So to address this challenge, the CZM program has looked to a newly established partnership with the U.S. Army Corps called the Silver Jackets Program. And this is a national program that brings resources to support initiatives addressing flooding. And in our case, that's coastal flooding and coastal hazards. So through the Silver Jackets team, CZM is working to develop focused discussions with entities with regulatory responsibilities related to shoreline management in order to improve interagency coordination. Participants, as you can see in this list here, represent federal, state, and county level agencies, and will work collaboratively towards identifying the main challenges to the current governance system and identifying strategies or areas of compromise to address some of these challenges. So for natural environment, currently the shoreline management regulatory framework is done on a parcel by parcel basis, which can lead to a fragmented approach. So CZM is wrapping up an exploratory study into how a regional scale of management could be applied to Hawaii. Some of the main questions the study set out to answer were, how do you define a region, and what are the types of data and or factors that would be important to consider to ensure a more holistic perspective. This study outlines a proposed methodology for defining regions using data that includes coastal features and processes, cultural and traditional knowledge, historic trends and future predictions, as well as place-based considerations. So by better understanding the natural environment and where conditions are similar, it opens up opportunities for more coordinated, large-scale and proactive interventions based on environmental conditions and how they interact with the natural environment and development, as opposed to being based off of property lines. So the study was a first step in a larger initiative to incorporate mid to long-term planning perspectives into decisions made along the shoreline. And there are still many questions to be answered, including how do you implement a regional shoreline approach? What tools and resources could be developed to integrate this into our existing planning and management frameworks? So we're looking forward to continuing work on this initiative. Moving along to the built environment. So regulations such as shoreline setbacks and special management area permitting help to control for new development in vulnerable coastal areas. However, there are still challenges around how to address existing structures. So in 2021, the state legislature passed Act 178, which requires the OPSD to work in coordination with state agencies with facilities management responsibilities to identify state facilities vulnerable to sea level rise and identify adaptation options. CZM mapped out 3 main phases to this initiative. The first one, to conduct a state facilities inventory and sea level rise exposure assessment. The second phase, to conduct vulnerability assessments of facilities in order to prioritize needs. And then the third phase, to identify a suite of mitigation and adaptation strategies for vulnerable facilities. So in the first year, CZM worked with 15 agencies to conduct an inventory of state facilities and conduct an exposure assessment to sea level rise scenarios. We found that almost all islands and agencies are vulnerable in the 5 tested sea level rise scenarios, with Oahu and Department of Education being the most impacted island and agencies. And then this past year, CZM evaluated a wide range of mechanisms with which to assess sea level rise vulnerability. And after getting feedback from our agency partners, CZM has recommended that the state pursue the development of a standardized approach to conducting vulnerability assessments for state facilities. We feel that a standardized process would provide agencies with actionable guidance to facilitate the prioritization of sea level rise adaptation needs within their own asset portfolios, as well as across agencies. And it could encourage an alignment of efforts statewide. So we're looking towards this outcome as an initial step to increase agency capacity and facilitate agencies' actions to integrate adaptation into their planning and decision making. And then last but definitely not least, the people. So as the federal government has been putting a heavy emphasis on social vulnerability with initiatives like Justice 40, there are many national scale tools and data sets used to identify vulnerable communities. Unfortunately, we found that much of this data that's being used either isn't available for Hawaii or is at a scale that doesn't provide a level of detail to accurately represent our communities. So for example, the census tract is a very commonly used unit. And here in Hawaii, census tracts often encompass many diverse communities, so it can kind of create a skewed representation or picture of what's actually happening on the ground. So last year, CZM was selected as a host to a 2-year NOAA Coastal Management Fellow to address our project proposal to use the concept of social vulnerability to identify communities with a disproportionate risk to sea level rise and coastal hazards. This project has outcomes that include a spatial analysis to overlay sea level rise and social vulnerability factors to identify communities at risk, a survey to collect more granular data on coastal communities, and then interviews to better understand what communities need to adapt to sea level rise. So there's lots going on in our office. Climate adaptation planning has many different facets, and we're hoping to address many of those through our various initiatives, all with the goal of developing a shoreline management strategy that builds resiliency and increases the state's capacity to adapt to climate change. So mahalo for the opportunity to share our work. You can check out our website, ormp.hawaii.gov, for more project information and updates. And with that, I'll turn it back over to Melissa.
Thanks so much, Sarah. Let's go to David Revel from Integral.
Hello, everybody. Let me just get this shared. Hopefully everybody can see this now. So I'm going to talk a little bit about adaptation pathways and sort of how we move beyond the vulnerability assessments. I'm going to use some broad terms and refer a lot to one case study in particular in Santa Cruz, California, where I live, and which also just experienced about a 50-year wave event that caused all kinds of road closures and destruction, and has been a very interesting time to witness how we go moving from adaptation to from vulnerability assessments. As soon as people see these exposure maps, the first question is often, well, what if we do something? And as soon as that question is asked, we're really starting to already move to adaptation. Then questions start to come up. How much does it cost? You know, the homeowners ask, what's my house going to be worth in 30 years? Or can I give it to my children as a legacy? The communities are asking what's my beach and my surf spot going to be looking like and functioning in 30 years or more. And then the politicians are sort of the monkeys in the middle and ask, how can I try and make everybody happy here? Everything that we, so adaptation approaches sort of fall into several categories. We can sort of do nothing. Some would call that unmanaged retreat. But there's also accommodation where we can elevate or setback. I know Hawaii spent a lot of time developing some excellent statewide setback standards. There's obviously protection with coastal armoring, or could potentially be more nature-based solutions with dune construction. There's also sort of managed retreat, which is, I like to think of as getting out of the way gracefully rather than evacuation. And then there's a hybrid approach where we can take a lot of different things over time. When we think about adaptation, we have to think about both projects. We can build a seawall or we can nourish the beach versus a policy approach, such as a setback standard or a repetitive loss program. These do fall into very engineer-centric or gray sort of infrastructure versus more green approaches where we're trying to utilize the natural processes and native materials such as sand or wetlands to help improve our resilience. Anything we do is going to have has potential secondary impacts. There's initial construction costs and ongoing maintenance costs. There's coastal armoring and protection, as an example shown here on the right. Really, when you hold the shoreline and keep it from eroding or retreating, it causes a loss of the beach, either burying it under a pile of rocks or drowning as the line is held, erosion stopped, and sea levels rise and drown that beach. This can also affect a lot of recreation, beach recreation, the towel space, the volleyball courts, surf breaks, fishing resources. It can fundamentally change the views and aesthetics. For many of you have been up to the North Shore and looked at some of the emergency, hastily placed sand burritos or sandbag efforts. You know, it's not, I think, what we want to see on our coastline. There's often there can be a displacement of underrepresented communities, a change in the access to this low-cost recreation. As you know, we start to lose beaches and lose surf spots, the loss of tourism-related revenues can decline. And there's also an effect on the ecology, turtles, monk seals, things like that here in the islands. There's a lot of challenges with adaptation. Currently, erosion is sort of mitigated in an emergency situation, and some great examples I'm seeing in my hometown. And what it comes down to really is a lack of community vision. We need a planned response to a disaster and not an emergency reaction. This vision needs to have both public and private interest considered. And so while adaptation is local, solutions need regional perspectives. One of the things that it's good to see Sarah just mentioned is sort of the regional shoreline management efforts to understand what the physical processes are at work across a region and what solutions may provide the biggest benefit over time to the entire region. There's limited dollars to either plan or consider solutions. There's a lot of uncertainty in the timing of impacts, predicting the next 50-year wave event, or how high sea level will rise in the next 30 years are all uncertain. And so we need to take, we need to identify a pathway or a phased approach. But then it raises the question of, when do we change from one adaptation strategy to the next? So what do we need to consider? We've kind of developed a framework approach to considering these, where we divide the coast into sort of different sections. Subtidal, where you have your surfing and fishing resources; intertidal, where you're skimboarding and bathing; your beach, where you've got all your sort of towel space, sandcastle building, volleyball, and then sort of the upland property, backyards, and then the development. So we need to consider the private and public infrastructure for recreational resources, both the uses and numbers of users in the beach, intertidal, and subtidal areas. We have to consider the ecosystem services, both the flora and fauna, water quality concerns, mental health, and then the economics. And I'm not going to talk as much about the economics because Dave Anning will be talking about that a little bit later. But everything has a cost. Some of those costs come at the expense of future revenues, and there's fiscal impacts to these that all need to be considered when we start developing adaptation pathways and planning. And by incorporating all of these developed infrastructure, the recreational benefits, the ecosystem services, and the economics, can really lead into a phased, optimized adaptation pathway timeline. So this one can be a bit complicated if you haven't looked at one of these before, but basically here we have sort of those general categories: protect and accommodate and retreat, and retreat. These are all the secondary sort of impacts, the costs, the impacts to beach surf and other recreational. In this case, this was designed for West Cliff Drive in Santa Cruz. Is this strategy going to narrow the road or recreational trail? And what's the life of the strategy? How long into the future will it allow resilience protection? So under protection, and within each one of these sort of categories, there's sort of a planning phase. If we want to relocate a highway, say the Cam Highway needs to be relocated, that's going to take 20 to 25 years to plan, permit, acquire, and implement and construct. And all of that needs to be factored into this sort of brownish tan phase, which is the planning. And then it's going to be in place for a certain amount of time and accommodate a certain amount of sea level rise and storm impacts. So each one of these has in order to know when it's time to make the next change and start planning into the future, we need to look for triggers, something that we can easily monitor, that maybe it's the number of times that Cam Highway is closed because waves are overtopping it, and it needs to be cleared of debris before it can be reopened. In Santa Cruz, we have a lot of revetments, so we need to maintain them, replace them with much smaller footprint soil nail walls or vertical seawalls, while we're designing a sand management program to kind of nourish beaches, back past sand, try and keep the sand on the beach with retention structures over time, much like Waikiki. Look at increasing development setbacks from right-of-ways, and then ultimately begin to relocate the roadways and trails to a one-way traffic approach, and then ultimately reroute traffic away. Now, here's some general categories of triggers that can be used. We can look at it by sea level rise. That could either be by elevation or a rate of sea level rise. It could be time specific, say by 2030 or 2050, we must do something. By exposure or by distance, how close is the road to the shoreline, or how close is the cliff edge to the edge of the road. By damages, by cost once we spend a certain amount of time, or a number of incidences something occurs. So for West Cliff Drive, these are all storm damage pictures from January 5th and 6th. And we had developed a trigger program. The short term was sort of disrupts traffic and the recreational trail. You can see the recreational trail here is clearly disrupted. This bridge is compromised here. So what we found is that even with this triggered program, that we triggered short-term triggers. We triggered 2 of our midterm triggers within 5 feet of the recreational trail and narrowing a beach width. And then we even triggered one of the long-term triggers, which was when the city spends over $500,000 over 5 years. This storm of damage alone is about $30 million estimate just along about a 3-mile stretch of coast, bridge replacements and things. And so this jumped us from a plan that may be here all the way out to here. And that was in one storm event. And so these triggers and all of these things are going to take time. So we've triggered this one-way road segment and a closed road segment. So now we're rerouting traffic inland. We've had this closed to only local residents. And then this is now only available to pedestrian and bike traffic. It's catalysting. And if you look at the New York Times in the last couple of days, there's been a lot of coverage on this disaster. And it's really begging a community dialogue about what the vision is supposed to be for what we want this to look like in the future. Roads are our open public spaces, and what we choose to do with them really dictates what's going to happen in the future. As part of a larger adaptation and management plan, we did a lot of economics and things that I don't have time to go into much detail on, but what we found that was of most interest is that recreation focused actions, those that enhanced surf, beach access and coastal recreation and maintain the recreational trail alignment, showed the highest benefit and probability of success financially over time. If we do a business as usual, which is fill the potholes and repair revetments, that costs the most in the long term. And if we looked at a managed retreat or a better maintenance program for our revetments, that performed much better if it started before 9 inches of sea level rise were observed. But the community reaction in many places, I give you any hurricane disaster, this one is to repair and not adapt. And the question then becomes, do we invest now in a program and make a substantial initial investment, or are we going to pay more later? And I think that comes down to the visioning. These riprap boulders in the new revetments are 18 tons each. That meant that only 2 rocks could come by flatbed truck, which leads us into sort of a very controversial elephant in the room of unmanaged versus managed retreat. Hawaii has a very strong policy of protecting the beaches. They have no new seawalls. They've not allowed emergency sandbags. However, there's been challenges, and this is one of the main challenges in the state right now, and everybody's kind of struggling, is there isn't a plan for acquisition, and the homeowners really don't feel like they have a lot of options. And so we really need to develop transparency. And I know that this is a discussion going on at the state level now. It's going on around the country, and I've been involved in many of those discussions. But managed retreat is really getting out of the way gracefully. It's managing the retreat by setting expectations. We can develop repetitive loss programs. FEMA has some that have been successful in certain locations. We can look at buyouts. We can look at hybrid land use decisions, downzoning certain areas to more open space. We can transfer development. I know that's been done in the North Shore to protect the ridgeline. We can also look at hybrid approaches where there's buyouts and leaseback programs. California's been trying to get one of those passed for the last couple of legislative sessions. And the economics show a lot of benefit. But really, it's going to come back to educating both contractors and buyers, disclosing real estate transactions, and then the monitoring of these physical changes. So just in closing, I think, we know that the impacts of climate change are uncertain. The timing of storms, how much sea level rise is going to occur. And so we need to develop a phased approach and a pathway to adapt. And this needs to be done at a regional level where adaptation it can be effective. You can't nourish one parcel and expect that to do much without a regional approach. But that direction needs to depend on a strong community vision for a 5, 10, and 50 year. And that needs to be done now. In Santa Cruz, for example, one could say that since the entire coast has been revetted and with revetments and riprap, the trigger to start planning a managed retreat strategy was 20, 30 years ago when those revetments were put in place. Now we're in a place where we kind of have to take action quickly. We need to develop equitable funding methods to create that vision. We need to value nature, beaches, surf breaks, turtles, and monk seals. We need to study nature's adaptation resources. I like to think of them as sand sheds, but where does the sand come from and where does it go and how long does it stay in the different places? Can we affect those in a positive way without causing down coast impacts? And then ultimately identifying triggers when the current management needs to change. So with that, I am going to, there's some resources here on some other case studies we've done, lots of work in Santa Cruz as well. But with that, I'm going to turn it back to Melissa. Thank you.
Thanks very much, David. Lots to think about there. So let's keep moving along. Let's go to resilient analytics. So that would be Jake.
Thanks, Melissa.
Jake, real quick, I just want to make a quick announcement that so we've got the chat back up and running, but the best way to get your questions answered would be to put them in the Q&A because it's easier for us to respond to them there. But I'm still paying attention, but feel free to put your thoughts in the chat, but make good use of the Q&A as well. All right, sorry, Jake.
No problem. Thanks, Melissa. Thanks for having me. A few topics we're going to go through. So I think to start, we're going to go through resilient analytics and what we do and our approach for a lot of these projects. We'll go through some examples and then some closing remarks. So with that, we'll get started. So resilient analytics has been around for over 15 years developing infrastructure models. And what we try and do is ultimately identify and quantify climate-based risks to determine adaptation and resilience strategies from a number of perspectives. And they could be financial and social, environmental, and governance. And we are a bunch of engineers that have been trying to bridge the gap between climate science and infrastructure. And that is our goal with all of our projects and trying to manage all of these other angles between social and environmental as well. So we're going to discuss the 4 levels of analysis that we try and take for all of our projects. And ultimately, climate impacts is a large data issue. And as I said, we are a bunch of engineers who have been introduced into climate science, and climate science is a big industry with a lot of data. And engineering is a bit more old school. Almost all infrastructure is designed based off of historic weather data, which is flawed for a lot of reasons, especially now because we know that the future weather and the future climate patterns are not going to be the same as historic. So this is just an illustration of really how large some of these projections can be. Data sets are often anywhere between 5 and 32 terabytes, which can be quite overwhelming. And the data is daily and includes a number of climatic variables, as well as inundation data. And integrating this into infrastructure is a challenge for a lot of different reasons. Daily precipitation and daily maximum temperature don't tell us too much about how infrastructure is going to be impacted, but a few calculations, whether it's changing to precipitation frequency curves or 7-day Tmax for roads, we can get to a point where we can start to estimate cost. And once we know a cost for reactive, we can start to think about proactive adaptation and weighing those options. So level 1 is awareness, and it's really just thinking about our future climate conditions. What are the future climate conditions projected to be in this specific area? So this varies greatly, depending on where you are in the world. It can be wildfire or landslide or sea level rise or storm surge or extreme heat days. And really this just sets the stage and working with the stakeholders of what climate impacts should we prioritize and what are the most important to our community or our infrastructure or any other lens. So that is level one, and that is the first step, and is also a start to sort of bridge into the analysis and get it started, because there is a learning curve when it comes to climate change and climate projections. Level two is vulnerability, and now we're thinking about, okay, where are my assets in relation to these climatic exposures, or where is the population, and what populations are vulnerable to projected climate change. And the focus is really not just on the awareness, but also when, where, how, and why these impacts are likely to occur from a social perspective, and from a financial perspective. It's important to know when these impacts are going to start and when we need to start investing and when we're going to start to see some damages. Level three is operational, and this is when we start to turn these risks into financial exposures and an economic risk analysis. In the example to the right, we did a project with the EPA that looked at the entire road network in the US across a few different stressors, precip, temperature, and freeze thaw. And ultimately the goal of this was to try and quantify how much are we going to see in increased repairs or maintenance or road damage and secondary impacts of delay and things like that. And in this case, freeze thaw does have some benefits in some cases. So this isn't always a doomsday. There are some, I guess, positives, but for the most part, it's working around and it's trying to figure out, okay, in these different regions for these types of roads, what are going to be the reactive costs and what can we do about it? And what's the general magnitude? Are we going to be increasing our local budgets by 2 or 3 times? And if it is, where is that money going to be coming from? And then finally, it's strategic. Now we're getting into adaptation. Now we have this reactive approach or this do nothing approach where we are either fixing roads or increasing maintenance budgets. Let's start to think about long-term planning. Can we invest now? And if we do invest now, are we going to see savings under a number of different stressors for a number of different infrastructure? And ultimately, this is when people start to raise their eyebrows, as this isn't always a doomsday approach. There is opportunity here. And it's not always that climate change is going to cost me $1 billion. There is opportunity to save. And that's an important part of this strategy. So we can go into a few examples. First in Boulder, Colorado, which is where we are based. We did an analysis with the municipality and worked with the city and the county on a number of different efforts. So from the awareness standpoint, we looked across and we identified all the hazards, wildfire and drought and increases in heat days and precipitation and urban flooding, and then tried to quantify them from a cost perspective. So the wildfire area in this wildfire zone was expected to increase by 38%. So how would protection of the forest and the homes, what would that cost? The severity and length of drought, that would impact water availability and agriculture and the water utilities. For cooling center operating costs, a public health issue, what would those additional costs be? And urban drainage. I noted this before, and going from daily precipitation to urban drainage calculations, precipitation frequency curves from Atlas 14, how are the 60-minute, 10-year design storms going to be changing? Do we need to upsize these culverts or bridges? And road maintenance in Boulder County, they were supposed to double, and trying to figure out where that additional budget would be. And then bridges and transportation and increases in cooling costs, and the list goes on. And this is an example of the municipality level, but we've also done more broad scale analyses on infrastructure investment from a national standpoint. So for the EPA, we did a climate impact study on all of the highways and bridges. So you can see across the country the differences in cost profiles between no adaptation and reactive adaptation and proactive adaptation, and how much benefit you can see from being proactive in this, assuming that all of these climate scenarios are going to happen, and also dealing with uncertainty. Currently, we're looking just at an average, but kind of navigating climate projections from an uncertainty perspective can also be challenging, and that's something that we do in a number of different ways. So this is the same study for the rail network, and this is infrastructure damage as well as delay, which goes to those secondary impacts. And oftentimes those secondary impacts can be really substantial, and sometimes can outweigh the actual physical impacts. Sea level rise. So this was a study to raise awareness on a city level, and this cost is presented at a state level, but we were looking to see what sort of public infrastructure would be inundated under a variety of different sea level rise projections and storm surge projections. And then based off of that length of protection, what would it cost to protect that? And what we found is pretty interesting. And ultimately, for a lot of these larger cities like Miami and New York, they have the capital to be investing these billion-dollar projects in seawalls and things like that. But for more rural communities on the coast of Maryland and elsewhere, what are the options there when a seawall or any sort of protection is going to cost millions of dollars? That has to come from somewhere. Otherwise, we start talking about those previously mentioned retreat and other types of adaptation. So just a few more before we wrap up. And this just looks at data center risk analysis and also highlights the design risk. So there is infrastructure being built currently. And another thing that we need to take into consideration is how these should be designed for the future. So looking towards ASHRAE standards and projecting them forward, or looking towards culvert design and thinking about how they're going to be changing, and ultimately building infrastructure that's going to last into the future. For these data centers, there was also operational risk and acute risk from flooding and wildfire, and ultimately these costs were significant. And there is a billion different examples. I'm not going to go through them. With that, I'm gonna wrap up, and I think I'll leave just a few closing remarks, which is climate change is a huge issue on a number of different reasons, and thinking about infrastructure and design and how engineering is going to change is incredibly important. And it is a issue that a lot of people are trying to combat, and we have made a handful of models, but there are seemingly endless number of models, and working with communities on these cost profiles and adaptation is incredibly important. Thanks.
Thanks very much, Jake. I have to say everyone's doing a great job staying on our time frame. So good to see more questions coming into the chat. Keep them coming, and we will wrap up with Dave Anning.
All right. Hi, everyone, and thank you for the opportunity to talk to you today. So economics has a number of potential roles in coastal management and climate adaptation.
Dave, real quick, we're not seeing your slideshow right now. We're seeing your PowerPoint. If you can share your slideshow.
Is that better?
Not yet.
Hang on.
You might need to share a different screen.
Okay, how's that?
There we go. Thank you, sir.
Okay. All right, no problem. Sorry to everyone. Okay, so economics has a number of potential roles in coastal management and climate adaptation, and I only have time to talk about one of those today, and that's about trying to generate those dollar figures, those inputs that go into the decision-making processes and the adaptation process selection that the two previous speakers talked about. The other types of roles that economics can have in assisting with the selection of those adaptation options, looking at the fiscal impacts of those options for the local, state, and national economies, optimizing the adaptation pathways. So figuring out, once you've selected your options, how and when some of those are implemented, and that sort of has a feedback process with those triggers that David Revel talked about, and also developing potential models for financing those, because in a lot of cases we're talking about local governments and municipalities facing adaptation options that are quite expensive, and they don't necessarily have the funds to implement those themselves. So why do we need values at all? People often say that economists know the price of everything and the value of nothing. And I myself did not come out of the womb as an economist. I actually started as a marine biologist and have worked in coastal planning and on environmental NGOs. I'm a surfer, I'm a fisherman, I have kids that I take to the beach. I actually kind of got into environmental economics because I was sick of losing environmental arguments on the coast about the management of coastal resources. Now, the reason why we need to have an idea of what beaches and coastal amenities, surf spots, and just the ecological values of the coast is because of the way that decisions are made about these adaptation processes. So governments that are making these decisions need to be able to demonstrate to the constituents, to the taxpayers and ratepayers, that they're using their money effectively. And also, as I said, often they're needing to apply for support or grant funding from higher levels of government or other sources in order to implement those. And that requires demonstrating that what they're intending to do is cost effective or is the best available option. Now, cost benefit analysis is the dominant decision support tool in most of those systems. It's not the only one. There are different sort of processes for decision making. And what I was finding was that unpriced or non-market values associated with the use and enjoyment of the coast, which I considered to be priceless in many instances, was not being incorporated into the decision in that way. So really, I wanted to be able to fight fire with fire, come up with values for the use of the coast so that the bits in front of the properties were being given equal decision-making priorities. Now, there have been some comments in the chat about and in the Q&A about a more holistic view of the values of the coast. I'm only going to be talking about non-extractive use values in this presentation. There are a whole range of other components of value of a natural resource. In this case, looking at a coral reef, some of those might be to do with their ecosystem functions, the habitat that they provide, sort of nursery functions, carbon storage, protection values of coral reefs is a really big factor for the islands and for Hawaii. If you didn't have the offshore reefs, then you would have much greater erosion and inundation impacts. So I'm only really going to be talking about recreation and tourism and aesthetic type of amenities related to property today. But I just wanted to acknowledge that there are those more holistic views of the value of an ecosystem or a natural resource. So I want to talk here about one method called the hedonic pricing method. This is an attribute-based valuation method. So it looks at either typically the job market or a property market, so a distributed market where people are able to make choices. So when people are looking to purchase a property, to rent a property, or like me, if you're looking for a hotel room when you're coming to Hawaii, you're trying to maximize the amount of utility or benefit that you get from that, subject to your budget constraints. So you may say, I want to pay no more than $150 per night, for example. I want to be near the coast. I want to have good public transport. I don't want to be too far from the airport. Those are sort of location attributes. You might care about the size and the quality of the room. That's sort of the property attributes, but then there are also environmental attributes. And by looking at a whole range of market transactions, we're able to work out how much people are willing to pay to be near the coast or for different attributes of the coast. So being close to a good surf break, for example. surfing is quite challenging on the south shore of Oahu this week because there's no swell coming from that direction. But people are making those decisions. This is called hedonic pricing method because people are being selfish. It comes from the same sort of root word as hedonism. People are trying to get as much benefit as possible, as much bang for their buck. By looking at many of those transactions, we can do those calculations and work out how much a property is worth. You can also do that for hotel room rates. So for example, ocean room views in Hawaii are priced much more highly than city view rooms or mountain view rooms. But some people may have different preferences there. So they may not want to be looking out to sea. They may want to be looking at the mountains. But really what I'm more interested in a lot of the work that I do is what would happen to the value of those properties and to the value of those rooms if there wasn't a beach there or if there was no surf there. So trying to examine those transactions and work out not just the value of the physical asset that's at risk, but how much of that value is attributable to the environmental amenities. Another method that is used very regularly in the context of recreation is called the travel cost method. So this is based on the understanding, which is sort of intuitive, that the people who like the beach the most go the most often, and they do that by locating themselves closer. So if you're a very keen surfer, then you will be willing to pay high property values or high rental values in order to live as close to the coast as possible in order to maximize the number of times you can go. Now, this is a survey-based method. We ask people where they've come from and how they've traveled, so we can estimate the cost. So the example here I've got is a very simple one, but we can get quite sort of complicated in that. We can ask people, if they walk or ride a bike, so they're not paying anything for gas or parking. We look at the opportunity cost of their travel time. So for many people these days, particularly for activities such as visiting the beach, where there's not really any costs associated with that, except possibly for parking, we are more interested in how much time they're allocating to that trip, and then looking at the value of that time and relating that back to income and wage rates, because there's an expectation that time cost is actually a sort of a negative. People are much more likely to go to closer locations than ones that are further away because of the time involved. Now, by asking a lot of people those questions, we can build up a demand curve. So there's simple sort of representations of the demand curve on the right here. We look at how much a trip costs them and how many trips they make over a certain period. From that, we can work out what's called their consumer surplus. That's sort of the added benefit, the value of their utility or the value of a beach day to them. So that is how much benefit people get from going to the beach. We turn that into a value for a beach day and then multiply that by an estimate of the number of people that go to a location or participate in an activity, and that gives us an estimate of the economic value of that. Now, a case study example of where this has been applied, some work I did on the Gold Coast. So this is the Gold Coast Australia, not the Gold Coast Kaimana. And I apologize to everyone on the phone for my mangling of Hawaiian pronunciation. But here we were looking at a proposal for some massive sand nourishment programs. So they were dredging sand from offshore. Now this is $20 million Australian, so the Pacific peso, it's not quite as impressive if you convert it, but they were looking at dredging and relocating 4 million cubic yards of sand. Now the cost of $20 million is substantial. This is a coastal city, it has quite a large budget. It's probably similar in terms of tourism revenue to Honolulu or Waikiki. So they do have the funding, but it's a $20 million investment. So they wanted to know if that was worthwhile. So what we did was we looked at how many people were using the beaches in the stretch of coast that they were looking at nourishing, and also how much tourism revenue was associated with actually going to the beach. So these figures that are presented here, that's not the total tourism for the region. We had some other data from research that we've done about how people would change their behavior if the beach wasn't there. So we'd ask people questions about erosion and climate change impacts. And so we had some existing information about what proportion of people would stop coming to that location if there was no beach. And when we looked at that, looked at the number of people and added all those things up, it was in the order of $85 to $86 million per year attributable to having a beach there. Acting as a buffer for erosion, which was sort of the intended purpose of this nourishment. But the recreational value alone was enough to justify that $20 million investment. And then because of the work we did and the spatial distribution of the values, they modified the way that they were going to implement that. So you can see at the bottom, there's a picture of a rainbow, that's called rainbowing sand. So they used our work there to sort of optimize how they were placing the sand in order to try and create some surf breaks in places where the sandbanks were normally pretty straight. So that was an interesting project where they used our work to not just to justify the project, but also to modify how it was implemented. Now, the other way, apart from looking at people's behavior in terms of the transactions and their trip behavior, you can also ask people how they would respond. So this is called a stated preference method. There's an example here, which is a beach holiday destination choice. And by giving people a series of choices between two options with varying sort of attribute levels, you can determine people's willingness to pay for components of those sets. So with a series of these choices presented to a series of a number of different participants, you can estimate people's willingness to pay for things like additional beach width. So you can work out a value per foot of extra beach. Now, per foot is kind of nonsensical, but perhaps for 20 or 30 feet of additional beach width, or for making sure that there's some beach there at high tide versus not having any beach there at high tide. You can also do this at the local level. So this is quite often done in terms of looking at people's decisions about which beach to go to. So I will say that in economics, we tend to prefer what people did rather than what people say they will do. But contingent behavior questions can sort of bridge that gap because people are much better at answering questions about what they would do in certain situations than purely hypothetical situations. Now, you can use estimates from elsewhere. Now, as was sort of said in the preamble, there hasn't been too much of this type of work done in Hawaii. That's appropriate where the physical and social contexts are similar. That may not be appropriate for places like the North Shore where you have iconic surf breaks, which really don't exist anywhere in the world. You can't replace some of those. And I also wanted to mention just a couple more things. The timing of impacts is important. Just last week, there was a closure of the highway at Waimea Bay due to a rockfall that came just over a week after the eddy was held there. So if the highway had been closed, a week earlier, the economic impact of that would have been very different to what it was, even though it was inconvenient and, a potential safety hazard getting people to cross the beach. I also want to say that the value of implementing a project to sort of reduce erosion or to provide that extra buffer depends on what you have there in the first place. So if you're in a remote location, you only have one beach and you lose access to that, that is much more of an impact than a place that has a lot of different recreational options. And also with a view to climate change, as the beaches narrow, the importance of putting additional sand into a system or taking actions to ensure that there still is a beach there at high tide actually becomes more valuable because of where you sit on that sort of utility curve. So that's all I had to say.
Oh, great. Perfect timing.
Yeah.
Okay.
And, yeah.
Thank you, Dave.
Again for the opportunity.
Okay, so hopping right into the Q&A, we have some good questions here. I'm kind of going to start with one of the broader questions about examples of mid and long.
Muted.
Oh, hello? Can you hear me? I'm not sure what's happening.
Melissa, I can hear you. What is the problem?
Oh, I thought somebody said I was muted.
Oh,
Okay,
we can hear you well. Thank you so much.
gotcha. Okay, sorry about that. So one of the broader questions was about examples of mid and long-term regional shoreline management. I think somebody referenced the first example that Sarah talked about, but I think if we could just name a couple of, if our panelists can name a couple of examples where that mid and long-term regional shoreline approach has been applied, that would be helpful for our audience. So Sarah, do you want to start?
Sure, yeah, thanks for that question. And just to say that pilot, that image of the pilot, I guess, delineation of Kailua Beach was mainly just to look at how the methodology for compartmentalizing shoreline region would be used. So was not necessarily at the stage yet to identify mid and long-term adaptation strategies, kind of just showing where those boundaries of region or subregion would lie. So I guess this question kind of gets to, this next phase of our regional shoreline project of what now, if we know where those regions are, what are some of the acceptable strategies that we would be okay with seeing in those areas. And, I see like a nice connection with David's adaptation pathways, and maybe that's an opportunity to create some adaptation pathways for the different regions and subregions. So it's definitely something that we're looking into kind of as a next phase for this project.
I think I said David unmuted as well, so why don't we go to you?
Yeah, I was going to say, there's examples around the country. Florida has been heavily invested for over 50 years in a long-term beach nourishment strategy to sort of maintain some kind of recreational beach for many of the communities, as well as a dune sort of barrier system. Texas has done a lot of that as well. So there's a lot of examples in the nourishment world. In terms of how we step back through time, I think there's not as many examples of that. I think looking at some of the more midterm strategies with sand retention and cross short growings to sort of retain sand on the beach and keep an inactive sort of some dry sand beach in typically narrow locations. Narrow beach locations is probably another example.
Thank you. Would anyone else like to chime in on this one?
I'll just plug another project that we're wrapping up. We are completing a menu of coastal adaptation strategies project, and it's basically an informational resource that is a compilation of a wide range of adaptation strategies that could be suitable for different scenarios and different sites here in Hawaii. And we're hoping to release that soon. It's going to be a website with some attached PDF files for each adaptation strategy, and those PDFs include information about general pros and cons of these strategies, what would be appropriate siting conditions, relative costs for maintenance, and then also what would be an appropriate scale in terms of, is it a short-term, midterm, or long-term solution. So that's something that we're working on that could provide more information on this question too.
That's great, thank you. That'll be a great resource. A question more related to the analysis of adaptation solutions. There was a question about how cultural impacts and social connectivity could be evaluated as part of that. So I think that'd be good for both Jake and Dave to chime in on it, as well as anyone else.
Yeah, it's a good question, and we've had some experience with looking at social issues, and specifically in Boulder, and it is a challenge, and it's thinking about how certain communities are disproportionate in both climate and in other aspects. And in Boulder, we put together a tool for the county that looked across block group levels and looked at social vulnerability coupled with climate vulnerability to highlight for them where they need to target some of these areas, where funding needs to go, and where those programs need to go. So I think it's an incredibly important piece of especially local climate adaptation. So.
Yeah, and I'll actually answer that in two different ways. One, in terms of what Jake was talking about, looking at sort of equity analysis, that is something that is a component of the work that I've done in the past, including sort of distributive analysis of the winners and losers of each of the different adaptation options and how that sort of is distributed across a community. That sort of leads me to my second answer, which is that there are some components of the sort of sense of place and cultural association of the coasts that I actually don't think should be valued. I think that should be outside of the economic process. And even in the sort of work that we do as economists to attempt to generate those values, really what we're doing is translating the community's preferences. Economists' role in that sort of task is not to make the decision or to sort of advocate for one option or another. It's to translate those sort of cultural values into a metric that can be used in the existing decision-making processes. I still do think that there are some components, particularly in places like Hawaii, where it should actually sit outside of that sort of cost-benefit analysis and that formal economic assessment, and that's something that planners and decision makers have to sort of juggle how that gets incorporated into the overall decision-making process. The economist's role is really only for decision support there.
It's refreshing to hear an economist say that everything can't be quantified.
Well, we could, but I don't know that we should.
Right. No, that's great. Great answer. Okay, so let's see. There was a question about insights about federal funding and how we position for that. I'm not sure if anyone here has thoughts about that. That different places, even if they don't have good planning practices, are benefiting from funding. I have heard that that Hawaii has a disadvantage because our building codes are not haven't been updated recently, so that takes points off our application. So I don't know if Sarah or others have insights on how we can better position for that funding, but that would be great to hear.
Yeah, that's a great question. And as you mentioned, the building codes, this is also partially why we are interested in doing this social vulnerability study is they're looking at communities that meet certain thresholds for being socially vulnerable, and due to the data availability for Hawaii, many of the communities that we here on the ground know need more resources don't show up or don't qualify based on these national scale tools. So again, kind of this disconnect between mainland and what's actually happening here. For us, CZM is part of the Coastal States Organization, and so they are sort of our link to DC, and they work a lot to advocate on behalf of coastal zone programs around the country. So I think that's a great opportunity for us to try and leverage some of that, to get in touch with our federal representatives and see how we can become more competitive for some of those federal funds. But yeah, that's a great question.
Thanks. I'm not seeing anyone else chiming up on that one, but so in terms of the community process, there was a question about success stories about that. So I know both Sarah and David were part of the North Shore Coastal Resilience Working Group, which was a local example. Maybe you can speak to some insights about that. But if you have any other examples about engaging community in these kind of conversations, that would be great to hear.
I'll take a swing at that. I think the North Shore community process, I think, was a good example of sort of a focus group approach to community dialogue, where you sort of have neighborhood leaders and liaisons that help to sort of participate from a neighborhood perspective and then kind of report back to their respective neighborhoods and constituents, if you will. And that can be very effective in sort of very close-knit communities. I'll give an example from Santa Cruz. We were working for 2.5, 3 years on the Westcliff Drive Adaptation and Management Plan, held 70 different community outreach events and meetings. And when the erosion happened, the city last night, Monday night, just had sort of a community roundtable. And they did a poll. The first poll question was, were you involved in any of this adaptation and planning work, a couple years ago? And less than a third of the participants had paid any attention. So it's the education of climate hazards and risks, the education of what the adaptation options are, has to sort of expand beyond just sort of the neighborhood typical meetings. It's got to be a continuous investment in education of our communities and agencies and regulatory staff and funders and electeds. So I think it's a multi-phase approach that has to be an ongoing initiative.
Thanks for that. Anyone else want to add anything? Yeah, I was also part of the North Shore working group, and it's kind of the first step in that direction with Surfrider and Sea Grant helping convene this conversation. And it was a good start. We identified some gaps in terms of perspectives that could be added to the table and follow-on actions. But it was definitely, I think, really interesting and beneficial for all involved to bring different perspectives to the table and go through a process of developing a shared understanding about what the hazards are and possible solutions to address them. And David led us through some adaptation pathway exploration as part of that as well, which was really great. So let me move on to another question. So, uh-oh, it just disappeared here. Oh, so there was a question for Jake. So a question about whether you costed the primary and secondary impacts or the cascading effects, and if you have a framework you use to approach this type of analysis.
Yeah, that's a good question. So for the study that I highlighted, which was for the EPA, the secondary impact we looked at was delay and vehicle operating costs. So the US DOT does have a valuation of time. And that was used as the basis for that. For vehicle operating costs, it is the connection between road roughness, but that is just a sliver of some of the secondary impacts, right? I mean, and if you go across infrastructure types, it also changes. For urban drainage, you can start to get into water quality impacts and things like that. So for that example, we highlighted those secondary impacts. And another thing to mention is cascading impacts, which I'm gonna also think about separately, is climate impacts that are cascading together. So wildfire and extreme precipitation and landslides and things like that. So depending on the model, we do analyze that. For the specific example, we weren't thinking about that. We were treating those things independently, in which case it was conservative, because if you think about how temperature would impact pavement and increase cracking or rutting or things like that, if you couple that with precipitation and freeze thaw, you can start to get some secondary and cascading impacts. So I think it is highly dependent on the infrastructure, and I think some secondary impacts are relatively easy to quantify, and I think delay is often the one that we reference to, because it is usually one of the larger ones as well. And when it comes to infrastructure, it's one of the more important and costly ones. So
thanks very much. So I think we have time to address one more question. I think this might be for Integral. So this is a question that just came in on how do you pick the type of assets and scales to develop adaptation pathways? So, how granular should that scale be? If it's a whole corridor versus an individual block, neighborhood versus home. So I'd like to get both David and Dave's thoughts on that before we hand it back over to Veronica in a few minutes.
Sure, that's, I think, one of the biggest challenges in adaptation pathway development and planning is identifying the appropriate scale. Sarah mentioned sort of that, what projects and solutions are feasible. And feasibility is, you really have to understand what the causative hazard is. A buried pipe that has wave overtopping and flooding over the top, probably not at major risk. If that, sewer main or water main is eroded, then we have big problems. And so in order to address that, you really have to understand the causative hazard and the extents of those hazards. And you have to understand what scale of application each adaptation strategy is appropriate for. A seawall can protect a single house, a beach nourishment most likely would not. So there's sort of a whole range of things that need to be considered based on the type of hazard and the applicability of each strategy to increase or reduce the risk. And that's probably the short answer. I could go on for days.
Sure. So from an economic perspective, the necessary or the relevant scale of the analysis is defined kind of in two ways. One, initially by the client and discussions about scoping, but also in terms of understanding the substitutes and the way in which people will respond to certain changes. So, for example, if you're in a certain location and if one beach is eroded, they just go, a mile down the shore and it's still within the same municipality. That's a sort of transfer within the same economy, not necessarily a loss, although there may be a juice bar or a burger shack or something that loses quite a lot of business. But from the sort of municipal perspective or the local economy perspective, that may not be a loss. Sometimes that may be moving somewhere further afield or doing something else entirely. So the scale of the analysis is an important component of any type of analysis that I do, and it's defined kind of in those two different ways, with discussions with the community and also an understanding of the types of impacts and what would happen next. So that sort of the what if that David spoke about.
Fantastic. I just want to thank you all for all your insights. Sorry, did I cut you off, David?
I just wanted to add one quick point too, and that I missed and trying to answer quickly and efficiently. And that is, you really also have to understand the physical sort of compartments that these processes are working through. I like to think of sand sheds, where the sediment's coming from the watersheds, from the reefs. Where is all that sediment coming from that we find in our coastal systems? That's ultimately what we need to be planning at a regional level, because inputs across those systems at different places, how the transport of that moves around, that really is the right scale to do regional adaptation, even though there's local flavors depending upon the hotspots.
Right. Okay. Thank you very much to all of you. This was a great discussion, and I'll hand it back to Veronica to close us out.
Melissa, thank you so much. You did an excellent job moderating, and also thank you to our speakers, Sarah Chang, Jake Hellman, who is filling in for Paul, David Ravel, as well as Dave Anning. Thank you all. It was a great, very rich discussion. To wrap up this discussion on beyond hazard and vulnerability planning, weighing the costs and benefits and challenges of climate adaptation. Well, what is next? Several folks from the audience have been asking about the recording and also the presentations. Everybody who registered for today's webinar is going to be receiving an email from PICHTR when both the presentations and the recording are going to be made available. They're going to be posted on PICHTR's website, so please stay tuned for that. I also put in the chat a link to a Survey Monkey. That is to give us your feedback on today's discussion, as well as to give us ideas on future discussions and help us understand how we can better serve you. with that, I would like to again thank all of the speakers, Melissa as the moderator, and everybody from the audience for being here, for your comments and your participation. You know, this is part of PICHTR's Climate Adaptation Collective webinar series. Please stay tuned for future webinars. We will be emailing you on upcoming events. So with that, thank you so much. And yeah, we are officially done with today's session. Take care, everyone. Until next time. Goodbye.